Okay, in this session, I want to continue on commercial liability. One thing I'll mention, earlier we were talking about business continuation insurance, um, business income loss coverage. I think what's interesting with COVID-19 going on, there's been quite a few articles written about how firms are trying to see if COVID-19 is something covered by business income loss coverage or business continuation insurance. The answer has been generally no, but there is an article I thought very interesting that in New Jersey there was some legislation being passed to require insurance companies to cover COVID-19 under business loss coverage. Very similar to what we talked about with storm surge and with the mold issue. If actuaries price a business with storm surge, that's never been covered. The courts have consistently said that's not covered. Same thing with pandemics. The insurance companies have made it clear that business income loss does not cover for pandemics. That's been ruled on for decades, and yet here's New Jersey thinking about forcing insurance companies to cover that. That would be one of those huge events that would probably shut the industry down in that particular coverage. There's a entity that I deal with. It's a not-for-profit, and they're being very much hurt by COVID-19, and so I had them call the insurance company and just see, and sure enough, the insurance company said, no, that is not a loss that you're covered for. So it's, the insurance industry is part of this issue. I know a couple of students have been interested in doing an article on how COVID-19 is impacting the property and casualty insurance industry, and that's one of the angles that would be very, very interesting, and there's certainly several articles out there about it. All right, so let's get into liability. Legal liability can come from three places. It can be criminal liability. Insurance does not cover criminal acts. That's one of the exclusions in almost all insurance contracts. Is if it's a criminal act, a loss coming from a criminal act is not covered. Contract law is a very special area. You spent a lot of time talking about contract law in your business law class. Insurance doesn't apply in contract. So the last one is tort. Tort is simply a general term for a wrong that someone does to someone else. And there's three types of torts. There's negligence, which we'll talk quite a bit about negligence. Insurance does cause this. It's an unintentional act that causes loss. It can be just normal negligence, or it can be gross negligence. We'll talk a couple of cases related to gross negligence. You have a social responsibility, a duty of care, that if you violate that social contract, you can be sued. And in that case, your insurance would give you some protection. There are intentional torts, things like libel, slander, false imprisonment. Insurance does cover these. Normally insurance doesn't cover intentional acts, but with liability, with tort, there are some that are covered. And we'll talk a couple cases with libel and slander. And then there's strict liability. We'll get into that when we talk about workers' comp. That's when someone is liable even though they weren't at fault, even though they did everything exactly how they were supposed to do it. They're actually sued and they have to pay because of this idea of strict liability. Workers' comp is a strict liability example. Now, to have a claim against someone, there must be damages of some type that money can correct. So if you hurt someone's feelings, yeah, you could say that's negligence. It could even be intentional. And you might even say slander or libel, but if there's no damages, the person's feelings are just hurt, then there's no liability and nothing to be paid. So negligence and how it arises, you have a duty of care to another person. The plaintiff was owed that duty from the defendant. So if you're the defendant, you've been sued for negligence. The plaintiff says, hey, that person owed me a duty of care. They didn't perform that duty of care. the defendant directly caused an injury. The defendant's actions were the approximate cause of the damage. It can't be really remote. It has to be somewhat a clear link. And then it's a subjective decision by a judge or a jury to decide if that plaintiff has a strong case. With tort, it's the preponderance of the evidence. It doesn't have to be beyond a shadow of it's not the same as in criminal. The burden of proof on the plaintiff is not as great as it is in criminal law. So unintentional torts and intentional torts. Intentional torts are defamation of character. It can be in writing. That's called libel. It can be spoken. That's called slander. Trespass. Again, with trespass, it is intentional, but there has to be damages. Just because someone came on your property doesn't mean you can sue them unless they did some damage. Conversion is just a nice way of saying theft. Assault and battery. Assault is a threat. Someone fears for their life. Our battery is actual physical harm. Obviously, battery, there's going to be damages. With assault, there can be damages if the person suffered severe stress. And then false imprisonment. Again, there must be damages. There's several very interesting cases. I don't have them in my notes, but some really incredible cases of false imprisonment. The damages you can receive, pretty important here. You have compensatory damages and punitive damages. We talked a little bit about this when we were talking about uninsured motorist coverage. Compensatory damages, you have special damages, which is your money losses, the actual bills you had, doctor's bills, property damage, replacement. And then general damages, that's where your pain and suffering comes in. And then punitive damages, this is where you didn't really have damages. You with your compensatory damages, you got compensated everything you need to be compensated, but you get additional compensation, punitive damages, in order to make an example of the defendant to try to discourage others from doing something like that in the future. We'll see punitive damages can be a major part of these cases. So that's going to get us into tort reform. We'll talk about tort reform. Some people have argued that punitive damages are shutting down America's businesses. We can't operate, we can't function because we have these huge, almost lottery-like lawsuits going on. So we'll ask that question. I'll give you two examples. The McDonald's coffee is the one you hear the most often. You probably have heard, some of y'all probably have seen that it's, and we'll get into it right here, that it's actually not a good example of tort reform, because I think most people, once they look into the details, actually see that this was a legitimate case by the plaintiff. I'll give you another one, BMW, a paint job case, which might question punitive damages. So here's McDonald's case. I don't want to read the entire thing to you. You can read through in your notes. But the jury awarded $160,000 to cover medical expenses and compensatory damages and $2.7 million in punitive damages. I think that got brought down quite a bit. So what happened? A lady is going through the drive-thru. She's sitting in the passenger seat. She orders coffee. And trying to open the coffee, it spills all over her. And so she sues. And she gets this large award. And people have been using it constantly as an example of why our liability system is out of whack. People are getting too much money for very small harms. But let's look at this. First of all, there's $160,000 to cover medical expenses and compensatory damages. She did have medical expenses that were fairly high, and then compensatory damages, that's the pain and suffering, and then $2.7 million in punitive damages. So essentially, they're saying McDonald's did something so egregious they need to be taught a lesson. So is this a frivolous litigation? So her attorneys argue that McDonald's coffee was defective, that it was too hot. McDonald's refusal to offer more than $800 in settlement for she had $10,500 in medical bills, and they only offered $800. See, McDonald's argument that this was her fault and not their fault. She should have been more careful. She had hot coffee. She should have known to be more careful. Well, let's look at this lady. Her name's Stella Liebeck. She's a 79-year-old lady. She was wearing cotton sweatpants. They absorbed the coffee and held it against her skin. Now, here's the part I think most of you think, oh, well, hot coffee, big deal. It's painful, but it's not a big deal. But she had third-degree burns on 6% of her skin and lesser burns on 16%. She was in the hospital for 8 days. She underwent skin grafting. She lost 20 pounds during that time, reduced her down to 83 pounds. She had 2 years of medical treatment followed. So this was not some minor, oh, there was discomfort. She actually had some fairly serious medical issues. McDonald's says they serve their coffee at 180, 190 degrees. The coffee can cause third-degree burns. I think most people think, well, if I spilled coffee on myself, it wouldn't cause that much damage, not realizing that the coffee is scalding hot. The company had several problems before, 700 reports of people being burned by their coffee. They had settled those for more than $500,000. McDonald's quality control manager testified that his number of injuries was insufficient to cause the company to evaluate its practices. He argued that all food hotter than 130 degrees constituted a burn hazard, and that restaurants had more pressing dangers to warn about. Now, there is comparative negligence. We'll talk about that. The jury decided that McDonald's was 80% at fault and that this lady was 20% at fault. There was a warning on the coffee cut, and the jury decided that the warning was neither large enough nor sufficient. So if you read through that, I actually think she had a legitimate case. The judge did reduce the punitive damages to $480,000. They've settled out of court finally for $600,000. But I think McDonald's did this lady wrong. Whether punitive damages is what it needed, you can certainly ask if McDonald's, as large as it is, paying $600,000 is really going to change its practices. I think they actually came out somewhat ahead on this because the press covered this as a frivolous lawsuit, and I think McDonald's actually got some sympathy points from this case, even though I think you could certainly argue that this lady deserved a better offer than $800, certainly. Now, a second case that has often been used as a frivolous lawsuit is this guy, Dr. Gore. He bought a BMW and later discovered that the vehicle had been repainted. BMW revealed that they do sell damaged cars if the damage could be fixed with less than 3% of the cost of the car. So this guy bought a car. It had been damaged, and I don't know how he discovered that it had been damaged, but BMW fixed it, sold it to him anyway. So obviously if you have a car that's been damaged and repaired, it could reduce the value of the car some. So the jury awarded $4,000 in compensatory damages, but they were awarded $4 million in punitive damages. That was later reduced to $2 million. The punitive damages, to stand, what the courts say is the damages must be reasonably necessary to vindicate the state's legitimate interest in punishment and deterrence. Punitive damages may not be grossly excessive. So what the court looks at is the degree of reprehensibility in the defendant's conduct. They look at compensatory damages. They don't want to be a big difference between compensatory damages and punitive damages. So, there are some standards, and often you'll see a jury award really high numbers and the judge bring it back down, or maybe the firm will appeal, and then they'll settle out of court. The court found that BMW's conduct was not particularly reprehensible. The ratio of actual potential damages to punitive damages was sufficiently high. The criminal sanctions available for similar conduct was limited to $2,000, making the $2 million assessment too severe. But the court noted that these three factors can be overridden if it's necessary to deter future conduct. The Supreme Court of Alabama ordered a new trial unless plaintiff accepted a smaller amount of $50,000. So essentially what the court was saying is BMW needs to tell its customers that the car they're selling has been damaged. And we need to somehow warn them in a way with this penalty such that next time they'll think about it differently. $2 million does seem excessive, and you can see the court stepped in and they questioned that. There are some other cases that are even more egregious, but those are the two I think you see the most often, and they're a little bit more legitimate than some of the more extreme ones. So let's say you've been sued for negligence. What defenses do you have? Well, consent is one that you have, either expressed or implied that the plaintiff knew they were taking some risk, they knew they could get injured, and they did it anyway. This is one of the reasons, I don't know if you've ever noticed, if you do something like take ski lessons or go on a trip, and whoever's sponsoring the trip will make you sign a waiver of liability. Those waivers of liabilities really have no legal power. You can't sign away your right to sue for negligence. But what they might do is provide some evidence to the court that you consented to the risk. I remember I took a group skiing, and I decided to buy a couple of the people on the trip some ski lessons. And when we signed up, they had a waiver of liability, and they said on that waiver of liability that we were agreeing not to sue for negligence, and not just negligence, but even gross negligence. And anytime I sign something like that, I always write on the side that I do not give them my right to sue for negligence, and especially not for gross negligence. And just think about it, it's just pretty obvious. You sign that, you're a beginning skier, and the first day they take you up to a double diamond slope, the most dangerous slopes there are, and they push you off as a beginner, and you go down and you break out every bone in your body, and they say, oh, well, you can't sue us because you agreed not to sue us for gross negligence. That's just ridiculous. Of course you can sue. But that's the consent, and that's probably the main power of those liability waivers, is it shows some evidence that the person realizes they're doing something that may be a little dangerous. We talk about contributory negligence. In some cases, it can be a complete defense, but in the U.S. today, they tend to take that in consideration, like we saw in the McDonald's case, of awarding percentage of contribution. There's the last chance or last clear chance defense, that the plaintiff saw this happening and they could have stopped, but they continued, maybe thinking they could get a liability claim out of it. So if the plaintiff can show that his negligence had been spent and the defendant had a last clear chance to avoid the injury. So this is somewhat of a debate about the plaintiff's duty of care to have avoided being harmed, and the defense and what they did. If it's an illegal act, then there is no liability there. If it's intentional, like libel or slander, your defense is that it's actually true. If you're telling the truth, it's actually true, unless, and there are some cases, and this gets into contract law, if you had a duty of confidentiality, then you can be sued, but that's more under contract law because you had a contractual relationship. And then the last thing is you just prove that you're not negligent. If you're just a normal person on the street, you have a prudent person rule, which is to ask, how should a person act given that we have societal norms. There's certain things you should do as a human being to protect other people. If you're an expert, you're a professional, that doesn't apply to you. You have a higher standard of care, and we'll talk about that next. We're going to talk a little bit about professional liability insurance or errors and omissions insurance, different standard. But for the average person on the street, there are norms that we need to comply with. So in the next session, we'll get into some more specific topics related to professional liability and some other general liability claims.